Iron Hands arguably used to be the best Pokemon in all of Scarlet and Violet. While this has changed with the Indigo Disc DLC due to the fact that things like Psychic Terrain are on the rise, as well as the move Psychic Noise now completely stopping use of Drain Punch, and many other factors that really do not benefit it in Regulation F, Iron Hands still was, at one point, one of the most terrifying Pokemon you could have fought this generation. However, this isn't really a big deal, because in today's video, just like we did with Fluttermane, we're actually sending our future Pokemon all the way back to the past. Today, we're going to be looking at how good Iron Hands would be in previous generations for VGC in order to see if it would actually be a broken Pokemon to introduce in a generation like Oras, Ultra Sun and Moon, or in Sword and Shield. Just like with our Fluttermane video, we are going to ban the use of Boost Energy, as every other factor could in theory have existed in previous generations, but with items getting introduced all the time in later generations for mechanics that used to exist, such as Terrain Extender, it doesn't really make sense to send this back with us, and that will become very important in a later portion of it. With all that intro out of the way, let's get started with Iron Hands' viability in the Oras metagame. Looking at VGC 15, this is probably the closest format to our current Regulation F1, and this is going to push Iron Hands way to its limit and beyond. There's honestly a lot to unpack here, because a lot of the noteworthy Pokemon in Oras do actually give this thing a lot of problems. Starting off with the top 10 most used Pokemon, this consists of Landorus Therian, Mega Kangaskhan, which are both above 50% usage. We also do have Pokemon like Heatran, Amoonguss, Thundurus, Sylveon, Aegislash, Cresselia, Politoed, and Mega Gardevoir, all of which have incredible usage. There's also a lot of lower usage Pokemon that would still give a lot of threat to Iron Hands, such as Charizard Y and Mega Mawile, that both have really high tour success, as well as Volcarona, Rotom Wash, and a plethora of others that could all in some way, shape, or form harm the hands. Despite claims that Oras teams, especially 2015, were littered with very little team diversity and mostly just repetition, there was actually a lot of versatility in this format from what I found. I think the best place to start off with is going to be in the Megas, because there's a lot of Megas that actually give Iron Hands a ton of issues in competitive. Oras, it was pretty much mandatory to run at least one, if not two of them, and considering the fact that Mega Gardevoir, Mega Venusaur, Mega Camerupt, and Mega Metagross, all of which were Day 2 level Pokemon at Worlds, give this thing an incredibly difficult time in competitive. It's already not looking like a good start. On top of this as well, both Mega Charizard X and Mega Salamence could honestly probably just outdamage most Iron Hands spreads while taking hits pretty comfortably due to their immense physical bulk. This is already going to be a pretty uphill competition where the hands are going to have a difficult time climbing to the top. On top of this, Iron Hands has a much more difficult time handling the likes of Landorus Therian. Most of the time you'd see Terra Water sets from Iron Hands as a really good means of getting around Landorus, so you could just support a partner Pokemon and exist on the field simultaneously with it. But with Landorus now having a super effective matchup at all times with its ground stab, and also just ground typing being a lot more viable thanks to the use of Earthquake being a much better option in Generation 6, it's starting to not look good. Now, despite Volcarona, Amoonguss, and Sylveon all having use in Scarlet and Violet, and they're all Pokemon that don't necessarily influence the usage of hands, especially in earlier regulations, in Oras, that's a bit different. We now have two Pokemon that can very easily status Iron Hands, and while Safety Goggle sets could still be good for getting around Amoonguss, what about for Volcarona, which can just still easily burn you, and Sylveon, which without Terra, you can easily just outdamage you? It seems like there's a lot of Pokemon that all are extremely viable in this format, consisting of some of the best to rather good middling options to partner with those top tier Pokemon. But does this mean that Iron Hands would be completely unviable in Oras? Well, actually, I do think that Iron Hands would still be a pretty strong option here. While I don't think we'll see the likes of like Regulation D Iron Hands or anything, where it's one of the best Pokemon in the format, I think Iron Hands would actually manage to survive, and our best contender for a comparison to this would be none other than Scrafty. Now, Scrafty proved to be one of the best fake out users you could actually manage to use in Oras due to its ability to pressure Pokemon like Mega Kangaskhan and Aegislash, which were also some of the best Pokemon in this tier. With Knockoff, you're able to clear through most items, which is a lot more valuable in a close sheet setting, and Scrafty also had the ability Intimidate to partner with this, which allowed it for a really good team supporting role. I think Iron Hands could make up for this though, since Iron Hands is a much better stat distribution, being not only slower than Scrafty, which is great for Trick Room teams, but also just a much better bulk and offensive spread here. Iron Hands is essentially just optimized Scrafty when it comes to its stats, and especially in this format where it is slower than Scrafty, and how Oras was such a Trick Room centric tier, I think Iron Hands could prove to be a really good option for a much more offensive fake out user. I think you'd have a bit of 4 moveset to in this format though, but options like Wild Charge, Fake Out, Drain Punch, and Ice Punch could all be pretty good and would get you a really good set of mileage in this format. This would probably lean in line towards going with an Assault Vest moveset, but you could use options like Detect and Sword Stance to still muscle through opponents, especially if you're running a Safety Goggles or a Lumberry moveset here. I think Ice Punch would especially be useful in ORAS though, since you would no longer have the ability to use Clear Amulet to get around stat drops, and on top of this, Landers is a much more noteworthy threat, and you don't even have the ability to force it to go for a Terra Flying in order to hit it with super effective Wild Charge. Now I did mention that Assault Vest would probably be the best item, but Safety Goggles is still great. There's a lot of Breloom and Amoonguss usage in this format, so getting around Sleep is really valuable, while also avoiding Rage Powder from Volcarona and Amoonguss, both of which could put a lot of pressure on you with getting burns or Rocky Helmet damage off. Overall, I do think Iron Hands would still be a noteworthy option, and teams would have to respect it, but I don't know if I could comfortably say that this could be a top 10 Pokemon in this generation or anything, due to the fact that I feel like there's so many options to counter Iron Hands, and without Terra, I think it would just be a really good like high B, low A tier Pokemon. And I think Generation 7 is going to be a true paradise when it comes to Iron Hands, and it might honestly be the best generation that it will ever get in the history of competitive. When looking at Ultra Sun and Moon, we see a main focus towards Iron Hands probably wanting to run an Assault Vest set, though I do think options like Leftovers, Safety Goggles, and Citrus Berry all would have some merit here. I think Assault Vest would prove to be the best though, since there's a lot less of a need for Safety Goggles due to the existence of the Tapus, and I think multiple of them could actually be really good partners for Iron Hands. For one of the biggest Pokemon that Iron Hands will now need to get around is Tapu Lele, and if you can clear Lele's terrain, this means that you're in a good position. With that in mind, 2 of the best partners for this will be none other than Tapu Fini and Tapu Koko, and these also happen to be really good at checking Amoonguss, since you can block the use of Spore into your Iron Hands, meaning that you no longer actually need to care about being put to sleep by this Pokemon. Especially with Tapu Koko, you now have a really easy way to boost your damage output thanks to the Quark Drive ability, which actually has some really good practical use here, which is insane to think about, because if you were to use an electric type terrain user in Scarlet and Violet, you'd be stuck with using fucking Pincurchin. Now I will say that Tapu Fini could still have a lot of merit here, as this also helps with not only getting around Sleep, but also with getting around Burns. And that Water and Fairy typing would help a lot against common electric checks such as Landorus Therian in the tier and Garchomp, which would both be absolutely terrifying for Iron Hands offensively speaking. I do think that we could really start snowballing with just how much set versatility Iron Hands has in a format like this, but I'm going to kind of save it for later because it really relies around moves that were technically speaking not created in Generation 7. For the sake of argument though, because it's a very different discussion, I'm just going to kind of leave that out because frankly Iron Hands might still be the very best Pokemon of the tier, even without getting into that. And I think going down that rabbit hole of moves that were not even fundamentally created just gets much more messy as we go through this. Now Iron Hands would most likely work its way into some sort of balance, and I think that would be really great for this tier in my opinion. Some of the best partners would probably include Tapu Koko, Landorus Therian, and then some sort of backbone that would be able to revenge fairy types such as Kartana, as well as just a Pokemon that could maybe handle Landorus Therian such as Tapu Fini. Now, there's plenty of other options such as Milotic that could also find their way into that water type slot, but Tapu Fini was typically the water type of choice here, and it even had cores where Tapu Fini and Tapu Koko were on the same team at Worlds and had really high success. And I feel like that's pretty similar to where we'd find Iron Hands. There's a lot of other Pokemon you could slot into that very final slot, such as Incineroar, which is a great Intimidate Pokemon. It would help Iron Hands with its general bulk. You have Mega Metagross and Mega Gengar, which are great options for fairies. You have Amoonguss, which is a good support, allowing Sword Stance sets to shine, and many others. Truthfully, this is a hard Pokemon to kind of fuck up in a generation like this. If we look at the top 10 for Ultra Sun and Moon, Iron Hands also has a much better time against most of these Pokemon, only really fearing the Psy Spam core of Mega Metagross and Tapu Lele, as well as kind of Cresselia, but Cresselia can definitely be muscle passed a bit more due to the fact that there's so many ways to boost Iron Hands damage in this tier for a very low drawback. I think at worst, Iron Hands manages to find its way as like a third best Pokemon in this tier, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't think this would be the by far best Pokemon of all time, and it might have given something like Incineroar a run for its money this generation. So going into Sword and Shield, Iron Hands is gonna have a hard time in terms of its identity. It's typically known as a really prolific fake out user, and this is a generation where fake out kinda sucked. It's not completely unusable, but with Dynamax being a great way to stop it, you always had one Pokemon on every given team that could kind of just fake out for the fuck of it and get around Iron Hands. However, Iron Hands actually probably would have a completely different identity from its identity in any other tier, and this is where I think the biggest buff for Iron Hands truly would come. I do think this is where, in my opinion, banning the booster energy actually makes a really big deal, because in Sword and Shield, Iron Hands might be able to be a really broken option, just running booster energy and being an incredible offensive breaker here. But why would Iron Hands be such a prolific option in this tier? For starters, Sword and Shield had probably the worst generation for Fairy and Psychic types in terms of the top metagame threats. For viable Fairy types, it's really just Hatterene. And for Psychics, you have options like Indeedee, which is neutral to fighting, as well as Metagross, which is neutral to fighting, and then Hatterene, which is probably the best actual fighting check you'll get from a Psychic type. When you factor in that most of these Pokemon also don't like taking physical hits, and that Iron Hands now is arguably the easiest time it will ever have at setting Electric Terrain, we get into a bit of a messy situation here. I say that this is an easy time to set Electric Terrain, but it both isn't. With Iron Hands now having the ability to Dynamax, allowing you a really strong Max Lightning that can set your own terrain for you to activate Court Drive, it gets into a situation where Iron Hands both is a very spammable electric stab that not only has no drawback instead of the recoil damage, but it also only benefits Iron Hands. It's kind of a nightmare situation for this Pokemon. Now, opponents can definitely clear the terrain with other ways such as Max Overgrowth, but Iron Hands being able to just be an incredible Trick Room threat in this tier would be nothing to scoff at. I think we'd probably see options because of the boost energy ban that would most likely encapsulate something like a Power Anklet and being ran on a Trick Room team, with just a 4 attack set with an Assault Vest, allowing you a really strong way to just blow through most opponents. Now picture this. Iron Hands having a really strong Ice move thanks to Max Hailstorm that is now over 100 base power, a really strong electric move that can set its own electric terrain while dealing over 100 damage, a really strong fighting move that, while it does hit at around like 80 or 90 damage, would still boost your attack, so even when your terrain goes away, you could still wall break, and then a fourth move that can either be Max Strike in order to slow down opponents on the turn that your Trick Room might end, so you could still keep a speed advantage, or even an option like Max Guard if you're running a move like Detect, allowing you a form of protection against other Dynamax Pokemon. Sounds kind of scary, especially when that Max Guard could also just be an option like Sword Stance or Bulk Up, allowing you still a form setup after your Dynamax goes away. All these moves that I've just went over really only get into the common moves for Iron Hands, as one of the best new options that Iron Hands would have in this sort of format would be none other than using Earthquake as a nice Max Quake option. This gives you essentially a way to build in your Assault Vest thanks to the fact that you now gain a Speed F boost with the Dynamax, and it also allows you to change this from a spread move, so that's Earthquake, into a single target ground option for 3 turns in case if you need to get past, well, other Iron Hands. And to top it all off, there's a lot of viable partners for Iron Hands that could still set your terrain for you really comfortably, whether it's through coverage or one of the best Pokemon in the tier at the time being none other than Regieleki. Now, Regieleki would actually be a really terrifying option as a partner with Iron Hands, because with the Dynamax, you can now get a Max Lightning off that would instantly set your Quark Drive, allowing you for high damage output without needing to commit a Dynamax to Iron Hands. Now, looking into the top 10, I actually don't think there's a single Pokemon on this list that would even give Iron Hands a remote issue. The top 10 Pokemon for this tier consist of Incineroar, Regieleki, Landorus Therian, Rillaboom, Urshifu Rapid, Porygon 2, Urshifu Single Strike, Grimmsnarl, Torkoal, and Venusaur. And you can use your Dynamax in order to have a very positive matchup into every single one of these. I actually struggled to even find a Pokemon that would be remotely capable of consistently checking this, with the highest one being an option like a Mungus, which you could honestly still check with Assault Vest sets as well as you committed Dynamax, due to the fact that you could set your own electric terrain. Because of this, you could avoid Spore from Mungus, which now means you really only need to fear Rage Powder. But with the option for Max Hailstorm, you have a much stronger option to hit that Pokemon with now. Despite lacking Terra, which was a really defining reason for Iron Hands being as prolific as it was in Scarlet and Violet, I think Dynamax actually would benefit Iron Hands so much more in a drastically different way that it could overcome all these identity issues it would have hopping into Sword and Shield and still continue to be one of, if not the best Pokemon in this format. And I think this is one of the only Pokemon capable of hitting at 70 or 80% usage that Incineroar had hit at peaks in this generation. But how good do you guys think Iron Hands would be in previous generations? Do you think I'm overhyping it? Do you think it would be better than I thought? Let me know in the comments below, and also make sure to let me know what Pokemon you're interested in seeing next. I have a lot of ideas for Pokemon that I could cover with this sort of series, whether they're previous generation Pokemon that haven't been introduced to Scarlet and Violet that I can cover in a reverse sort of episode, or even going into a lot of other prolific Pokemon that have not existed in previous generations. Let me know in the comments below what you want to see, as I did get this idea for Iron Hands from one of you guys as well. And also, make sure to leave a like and subscribe so you guys don't miss any more VGC discussion videos. With that said, I'll see you guys in the next upload. Peace out, guys.